Hey everybody, this is Coleman. Welcome to Wheel and Wrench, episode 2. Today we're going to take this sidecar chassis, disassemble it, get ready for the next step of restoration. So sit back and enjoy. Okay, so first step is I want to get this fender off. It's attached by 4 bolts. Look at it here. You got a bolt over here, and in the rear, they're in the exact same location in the back, and those 4 bolts should remove the fender. The bolts themselves are traditional bolt and nut combo. We got hex heads in the front and the rear. Sometime in the life somebody has installed a flathead style bolt and nut in the rear. Bolts in the rear, they're a flathead style bolt and they have rusted quite a bit over time, and being a flathead style bolt, it's hard to get a wrench on it to hold it tight to break it free, so they do spin quite easily. So you could use rust penetrator of some kind, you can cut them off. But in this scenario, there's a bracket that runs from the fender to the frame, and if you take this bolt loose, when looking at it, the whole fender will come off, and then on a bench I can work on the bolts and get them cut loose. There's a singular wiring harness running through the fender that goes over to the motorcycle. We just cut it off in this scenario, and it should be quite easy to rewire. Another area of note is the fender clamps onto the frame. It doesn't go in front or behind. It does clamp onto the frame, and the bolt goes through the clamped fender. Once the fender's off, there is good access to the shock lower mount, the swing arm, the shock upper mount, as well as the back of the wheel. And have the fender out of the way, that allows for easy access to get to the wheel to get it off. To get the wheel off, there is a capsule nut located on the wheel, and you get that nut off, the wheel will come off. So first step is there's a cotter pin that holds it all together. And the best way to get the cotter pin out is to take a screwdriver or some kind of device and then straighten out the arms of the cotter pin that were flared out, and then take a pair of side cutters or dikes, and you can grab the edge of it that's rounded and then pull it out of the axle shaft. After that, you take the large capsule nut off, and then the wheel will come off. Once the wheel is removed, this gives access to the brake, and we have here is a traditional brake drum assembly with brake shoes, and then the axle is in the center. Now the brake itself, it's mechanically operated. There's a cable that goes to the back, and what happens is when you pull on the cable, it'll spread the brake shoes and then make contact with the drum. So again, you pull the cable in the rear, it causes the shoes to spread out, and then they contact the drum. This is a good close-up view of the axle and the brake shoes. So the next step is to get the backing plate off that has the brake shoes on it, and usually they're retained some way, either by pressed in or a snap ring or a bolt, and on this one it is pressed in. So the next step is to get the backing plate off. So to get the backing plate off, I had read after I've done this that you can use heat to expand it, and it should slide off quite easily. However, mine was able to come off by using a screwdriver to work our way around it, and then a hammer, and was able to slowly work it loose off the axle, and then take it off and get it removed, again using a hammer and a screwdriver. Now this area in the rear here, that's behind the backing plate, that area was flush originally. Right here where the screwdriver is located, this area was flush against the frame, and we have slowly started to remove it and then get ready to take it all the way off. Okay, once the backing plate is off, we have access to the axle, and I was trying to get a better idea how the axle is assembled in the frame. It appears on this model. The axle comes to the frame, and on the front of it there was a weld that ran around it, which appears to help hold the axle into the frame. And on the back side there is a cup that goes around a C-clip that's in the back of the axle, and that also appeared to have welds on it. Now, researching the axle through some forums, I read that they are pressed into a bearing in the frame. It's hard to tell on this one if that's the case or if it's in a metal sleeve or how it is retained, but either way there's a C-clip that goes in the back end through a cup, and it's either been welded or pressed in some bearing of some kind. For shock removal, there's a bolt in the bottom of the shock. That bolt comes out, loosens the bottom of the shock up. The shock is threaded into a mount at the top, and that mount is secured also by a little set screw on the inside. So remove the set screw, and then you can thread out the shock from this upper mount. After shock removal, the next step is to get the swing arm off, and its attachment point is in the front. There's a large bolt that goes across the chassis. It has a bolt head on one end, and it's threaded with a nut on the other. And how it is supposed to be removed is the nut comes off and the bolt drives out. This gave me some issues for a while trying to figure out how it's assembled. It's seized on a steel bearing that is inside there, and I had to cut the head off of it and then drive it out the other direction to get it all apart. But it's a large bolt, it runs through a steel bearing, and it presses into the tube, and that's where the swing arm spins on. So I took a pause in the action, took a break, and what we've done is we took off the wheel, the brake assembly, got down to the axle, and then we removed the swing arm. And with most oil projects, you usually run into some kind of hiccup along the way. Well, this one so far, it was the swing arm bolt or swing arm axle. It was a bolt that we had looked at in the front. Now, to get this out, I ended up having to cut the head off the bolt and then drive it out the other way. So I want to go through more detail what it was. Again, you've got the bolt like this. We cut the head off of the bolt to get it out. That goes in the tube. Then that slides in here like this. That's just a spacer. And essentially goes like that. A bolt goes there, and there's your bolt head on that end. But we got the swing arm off, and we keep going. Once the wheel's taken off, another important part to look at is the wheel bearing. There are two wheel bearings in this particular setup. There's an outer and an inner in the wheel. This is the outer bearing. And when I spun the wheel on the chassis before I took it apart, it wasn't too noisy, but when getting it on the ground and spinning it, I do feel resistance and signs of wear in this outer bearing. So it's definitely time to get it pressed out and look for a suitable replacement. And I will also do the inner as well while I've got the wheel off. Okay, so here's your inner bearing. Old grease coming out, and it feels good. I like the inner bearing. It's an up-close picture of the brake assembly. It's got a backing plate. This hole is where it presses on to the axle itself, and the arm is what activates the brake shoes. Again, as I mentioned earlier, there's a cable that comes in. When you pull this brake cable, it rotates the mechanical arm, which then makes a pivot go off on the inside on a cam that spreads the brake shoes. All right. The last thing to get the chassis tore all the way down is to get the mounts off. They are attached through a myriad of clamps with traditional bolt and nuts, and then light pressure into the tube itself. Now, they've been in there for so long, they did take quite a bit of effort to get out. So again, you take the nuts, the bolts off the clamps, and use some kind of persuasion to get the mounts out of the chassis, and then you have a tore down type bare chassis. But there you have it. There's the chassis, the Sputnik, all tore down, ready for sanding and paint. And after this, stay tuned, we're going to start taking apart the tub next of the Sputnik and get it cleaned up, sanded down, and the same thing great for paint when the weather warms up. So stay tuned.